we'll focus on a 160 kilometre or 100 mile event.
Yeah.
First things first, this has to be practiced in training. So I think, again, a lot of people do different things on race day than they've ever done in training, and things can fall apart really, really easily with, gut discomfort or not eating enough, eating too much, whatever it might be. So we always want to practice our race plan in training well before the event. So, not 2 weeks out, hopefully months out, that you can practice what you're going to have before, a couple of days before, morning of, and then what you're going to have throughout as well.
Okay.
So, if you practice, there's a couple of things I would consider for 160K or 100 mile event. We probably want to look at nutrition and fluids about 3 days out.
Okay.
Now, first thing I would want to talk about is carbohydrate loading.
Okay.
That one is tricky to give a broad, a specific advice, because it can be really different for a lot of athletes. What I see a lot of the time is that people go really aggressive with their carbohydrate intake, and they start eating loads of pasta, loads of bread. They throw in lollies, they throw in juice, they throw in all these carbohydrates because they've got to be carbohydrate loaded. What they need to consider is that leading into an event like that, there's a very good chance they're going to be tapering in training as well. So it's important to consider that if you're tapering and your training load has decreased, but you eat the exact same amount of carbohydrates as you normally would in a training week, you're naturally already carbohydrate loading because you're not using up that extra fuel. So if you then go and add in heaps of other carbohydrates, particularly foods that you may not eat, but you're adding in lollies and you're adding in all these other extra sugary things to try and get extra carbohydrates in, chances are you're going to feel pretty horrible by the time it gets to race day. And also important to consider that 1 molecule of water holds 1 molecule of carbohydrates holds 3 molecules of water. So typically they could end up putting on weight, and it was not necessarily fat mass, but they're putting on water or holding fluid. So they wake up on race day, they're 1 or 2 kilos heavier, and they feel really lethargic because they've been eating all these carbohydrates that they wouldn't normally. That's one example. I do think it's important that people carbohydrate load. It's just taking into consideration their training taper. But I also like to do a bit more of a slower carbohydrate load. So the day before, they're not just loading up and feeling horrible. They're doing that at sort of 3 meals. So over 3 days. So I typically get them to choose 1 meal a day that they feel comfortable with, load up on carbohydrates at that meal. Nothing that's going to make them feel super uncomfortable, but they might be reducing the amount of veg for that particular meal so that they can allow for a little bit more carbohydrates. I like to sort of use easy to digest proteins in the days leading up to it as well. So not so much red meat, but using sort of chicken and fish and vegetarian sources of protein as well. So carbohydrate load, looking at 3 days out, again, depending on what's right for you. Fluid definitely needs to start 3 days out, or hydration. So depending on the event and how hot it is, the main take home is just make sure that you're well and truly hydrated by the time you get to race day. You don't have to be overhydrated. You don't have to be peeing clear. We're just looking for a really light color urine. And that might just mean, an extra 600 mils per day, or if you're really good at hydration anyway, you're just doing your normal sort of daily hydration strategies. Really good tip is just drinking fluid with your food will help absorb a lot more water, because we naturally have electrolytes in our food already. So rather than throwing in salt tablets or electrolyte tablets days out, we could just drink extra fluid with our food, and we'll hydrate well.
Okay.
So look at the color EP first up in the morning for a few days out. If it's looking light colored, you're doing well. If it's really dark and bright, you've got a bit of work to do.
Yeah, okay.
And then the morning of, I think it's important to consider, carbohydrates, fluid, sodium, and caffeine are the four sort of things that I would cover off on. Now, again, a lot of people sodium load in the hope that they won't muscle cramp, and you can't chronically you can't chronically sodium load or electrolyte load because your kidneys and liver are just going to flush that out.
Okay.
So we ideally want to do that 2 to 3 hours before an event, which is going to align very nicely with a pre-race breakfast.
Okay.
So if you typically don't cramp, you don't want to be adding in a whole bunch of electrolytes and sodium because that may increase your blood pressure, for example. So again, important that you get a good understanding of how much sodium you're losing. Working one-on-one with a sports dietitian is always going to be good for that. But if you are a very heavy cramper and you're muscle cramping a lot, then it might be worthwhile using an electrolyte tablet or a couple of salt tablets.
Okay.
So morning of, we're looking for about 2 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram body weight. So 70 kilo athlete, we want 140 grams of carbohydrates in that pre-race meal, which is a lot. and typically a lot bigger than most people's pre-race event, pre-race breakfast, I should say.
Yes.
So,
and how many hours before the event?
Ideally 3 hours, so that we've got enough time to digest. If that's not possible, that's when our carbohydrate load in the days leading up to it may be a little bit more aggressive.
Okay.
Or if you're a nervous racer, we could use things like a smoothie or liquids to get in that extra carbohydrates.
Okay.
So that is 3 hours where you want the meal, but keep in mind you could have a gel or a sports drink or something like that leading into it, and that would still count towards your 140 grams of carbohydrates.
Okay. What are some ideas of what people could use for food? You mentioned fruit toast before.
I like using fruit toast just because, again, people don't like eating a whole lot of food the morning of a race. So one slice of fruit toast is going to be double the amount of carbohydrates as a single slice of bread typically. So we can get in, for two thick slices of fruit toast, we might be able to get in close to 60 grams of carbohydrates just there. We add in your sports drink and a gel, and we're almost at 140, depending on how much sports drink you're having, obviously. Maybe add a banana to that as well. Yeah, so it could be 2 slices of thick fruit toast, a banana, 600 mils of your sports drink that you're using, and then a gel before you race.
Yes.
For an event like that. And again, this is guidelines. It's not going to work for everyone, but typically it will work well for a lot of people.
Yeah, okay.
And that's going to cover off on your hydration as well. So, if you get at least 600 mils of fluid in before, if it's got some electrolyte in there, if you're cramping, but naturally wanting to hydrate well, you're getting carbohydrates in as well.
Yes.
And then caffeine, as I said, it may be something that you have before the race if you're not a typically nervous racer, but otherwise it's something that we'll time throughout a race.
Yes. We'll talk about that in the next video during the race. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that.
Perfect.